I carried that gift bag like it meant something. Pale gold tissue paper folded at the top, a card tucked inside with 30 years of everything I still believed pressed into 8 handwritten lines. I had never surprised Tyrus at the office before, not once in 30 years. But that morning I woke up and decided 30 years deserved something different. Something that said, I still choose you. I still show up. So I showed up. The building was exactly what I expected. Glass and steel, Midtown Atlanta humming around it, the kind of address that announces a man before he opens his mouth. I pushed through the front door and walked to the reception desk, where a young woman sat with a headset and a neat stack of visitor badges. I smiled at her. She smiled back. I said, I'm here to see my husband. I'm the CEO's wife. She looked at me, and then she laughed, not loud, not cruel. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard something that did not line up with what she understood to be true. She caught herself quickly, pressing her fingers to her lips, and I watched her face shift from amusement to confusion to something closer to embarrassment. She said, I'm sorry, ma'am. It's just, I know his wife. She comes in all the time. Black SUV, 4 days a week, usually on the executive. Staff just knows her. That's all. My name is Shantira Kingston. I have been married to Tyrus Kingston for 30 years. I have built a life, a home, a legacy alongside that man. And I am telling you, I stood at that reception desk and did not move a single muscle in my face. I said, I'll wait. If you're watching this and you've ever had to hold yourself together when everything inside you was coming apart, drop the time in the comments. I want to know I'm not telling this story alone. I sat down in one of the lobby chairs with the gift bag on my lap and I waited. The young woman, her name tag said Lorraine, went back to her calls. She was not the enemy. In her mind, she had simply made an ordinary comment about a woman the building treated like part of executive life. That was all. 12 minutes. That is how long I sat there before the elevator opened. Tyrus walked out first. He had his jacket on, that easy stride I had watched for 3 decades, the one that said he owned whatever room he was standing in. And beside him, close, comfortable, completely at home, was a woman I had not seen in years. They moved toward the exit together. Just before the door he stopped, reached over and straightened her collar. She laughed at something he said, tipping her head the way a woman does when a man has made her feel like the only person in the room. Then he pulled her in. The kiss was not rushed. It was not hidden. It was the kiss of a man who had been kissing that woman for a very long time and had stopped thinking of it as something dangerous. I sat 12 feet away and watched every second of it. Neither of them looked up. She walked out toward a black SUV parked near the executive entrance. A valet standing nearby nodded at her like he recognized the vehicle. Tyrus turned and stepped back toward the elevator without a single glance in my direction. I stood up. I walked out. I got in my car and drove exactly 2 blocks before I pulled over. I sat there with the gift bag on the passenger seat. I built something here. I just did not know what I was really building it for. My hands were on the steering wheel. They would not stop shaking. He kissed my cheek at the door the way he always does. Same pressure, same timing. Same hand briefly on my shoulder as he stepped past me into the house. 30 years of that kiss and I had never once thought about it. Tonight I stood in my own doorway and felt it land on my skin like something I needed to catalog. He smelled like the office. Cologne worn down to the base note, the faint trace of a long day. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have made my jaw tighten. I closed the door and followed him inside. He loosened his tie in the hallway mirror, the way he always does, glancing at his reflection for exactly 2 seconds before moving toward the kitchen. I watched him from the living room entrance. Same walk, same ease, the walk of a man who had come home to a safe place and knew it. That was the thing that sat in my chest like a stone. He was completely at ease, no tension in his shoulders, no careful choosing of words before he spoke. He moved through our home the way a man moves through a space that has never once threatened him. He said the Atlanta branch had a good day. Said it the way you mention weather, I said. That's good to hear. He opened the refrigerator, looked inside, closed it. Asked what I felt like for dinner. I said I'd already started something. He said good, he was starving. He sat at the kitchen island and picked up his phone, and I stood at the stove with my back to him and breathed through my nose for 3 full seconds before I trusted myself to turn around. We ate at the table. He talked, a contractor issue, a meeting that ran long, something about Q3 projections. I responded where it was natural. I asked a question once that made him laugh. He looked at me across the table the way a man looks at a woman he is comfortable with, and I looked back and gave him exactly what he expected to see. But I was watching his hands. Those hands cut his food and reached for his glass and gestured when he made a point. The same hands that had straightened another woman's collar that afternoon, with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. I kept my face still. After dinner, he said he was tired. He kissed the top of my head on his way out of the kitchen, another 30-year habit, and went upstairs. I listened to his footsteps cross the bedroom floor above me. I heard the bathroom door, the faucet, then quiet. I sat at the kitchen table alone, and something came back to me that I had not thought about in years. Before the Atlanta branch opened, when Tyrus was still in the early stages of structuring it, Renata had asked questions, specific ones, about the operational model, the staffing structure, how often Tyrus would need to be on site. I had answered every one of them. She was my best friend. I thought she was asking because she cared about my life. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went upstairs. I got into bed beside my husband of 30 years. I did not move toward him. I did not move away. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling while his breathing slowed and steadied into sleep beside me. I made a decision that night that I did not give a name to. Not yet. But I knew this much. The woman who confronts gets tears, apologies, and a story she cannot prove. The woman who waits gets something worth holding. I was going to wait. 3 days later, I drove to the office on a day I was not supposed to be there. I did not go inside. I parked across the street in a lot that faced the building entrance and cut the engine and sat there. I needed to see it again. Not the kiss. I did not need to see that twice. I needed to see the SUV. I needed confirmation that what happened on my anniversary was not an isolated moment I had misread, but a pattern with a parking spot and a schedule, and a woman who knew exactly when to show up. The black SUV was there. Same spot, same vehicle, parked near the executive entrance like it belonged there, like security and valet staff had seen it often enough to stop questioning it years ago. I watched the dashboard clock. I did not move. I did not call anyone. I just watched the front entrance and waited. 2 hours and 11 minutes later, she walked out alone. I did not have a clear view of her face from where I sat, but I did not need one. I knew the walk. I knew the unhurried ease of a woman leaving a place she had spent years teaching herself to move comfortably inside. She got in the SUV and pulled out of the lot and was gone. Tyrus never came down. I reached for my phone to note the toke timestamp, and that is when something shifted in my mind. Not dramatically, just a quiet click. The sound of two things that had never sat next to each other suddenly sitting together. My supervisory schedule. I rotate, Monday, Wednesday, Friday 1 week, Tuesday, Thursday the next. I had kept that same pattern for years. It was practical. It was consistent. I had announced it openly to branch leadership and senior administrative staff, so operational reviews could be scheduled around my visits. Most days I came through the operations entrance upstairs, instead of the executive lobby. I had never thought twice about any of it. I sat there and tried to remember a single time I had seen that black SUV in that lot on one of my scheduled days. I could not place one. Not once, not in years. She did not come on my days. She came on the days I was not there. Every single time. That was not coincidence. That was a schedule somebody had learned well enough to trust. I was still sitting with that when the front entrance opened again, and a man walked out alone. Wendell Pruitt. I had known him by name and by sight for years. Operations oversight, reliable, quiet. One of those men companies lean on heavily without ever putting them in glossy brochures. The kind of employee who notices everything because his job requires him to. But the man walking out of that building did not look like a man finishing a normal workday. There was something on him, a weight that did not belong to unfinished spreadsheets or delayed vendor calls. He stopped outside the entrance and looked back at the building once. Not casually, the way people do. Deliberately, the way a man looks at something he has spent a long time trying not to understand too clearly. Then he walked to his car and drove off. I filed it away. I did not know what he was carrying, but I knew the expression. I had been wearing a version of it for 3 days. I drove home without going inside the building. That evening, Tyrus called. Running late, a meeting that went long. I said, "Fine, drive safe." I hung up and sat in the kitchen with the phone face down on the table. Every late call I had ever received now had a different shape. Every extended trip, Every conference, every meeting that ran past 9. I was not recounting them with grief anymore. I was arranging them mentally, the way a woman arranges documents she may eventually to understand in order. The hands that had shaken 2 blocks from that building 3 days earlier were completely still. I needed to talk to Wendell Pruitt, but not anywhere near that office. I found the message thread at 11:43 that night. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my phone and scrolling back through years of messages from Renata Speaks, the woman I had called my closest friend for 12 years, looking for the exact moment the friendship became something else. The place where genuine became useful, where I stopped being her person and started becoming access to mine. It took me a while to find it, because she was good. We met at a leadership conference in Birmingham. She was warm, in the specific way that makes you feel chosen. The kind of woman who remembered small details, asked follow-up questions weeks later, made you feel like you were the most interesting person in whatever room you were both standing in. At the time, she was coming off a difficult breakup and talking about wanting a fresh professional start somewhere bigger than Birmingham. None of that felt strange then. I told her things I did not tell other people, about my marriage, about the Atlanta branch in its early stages, about Tyrus, how he operated, what kind of pressure he carried, how the company was structuring expansion. I told her all of it, because that is what you do with your best friend. I kept scrolling. There it was. A stretch of messages from years earlier, just before the Atlanta branch opened. Renata asking questions that I had read then as interest in my life. How often will Tyrus need to be down there? Is it mostly his team running operations, or will you be hands-on too? What does the weekly schedule look like for something like that? I had answered every question with the openness of a woman who had nothing to hide. At the time, I thought she was curious because she was considering opportunities in Atlanta herself. She had mentioned consulting work there more than once. I never connected any of it to Tyrus. Why would I? But sitting at that table now, looking at those messages after 30 years of marriage and one black SUV, the shape of it felt different. Not like a master plan somebody built overnight. Like attention. Like a woman paying close attention to a life she eventually stepped into farther than she should have. The branch opened. A few months later, Renata called to tell me she was relocating to Atlanta. New city, new clients, fresh start after the breakup. I was happy for her, proud of her. I never questioned the timing because it made enough sense on its face, and because 12 years of friendship teaches you not to inspect every coincidence for danger. I see now that proximity did the rest. Tyrus was in Atlanta regularly. Renata was there regularly. And somewhere between business dinners, branch openings, conferences, and years I was not looking in that direction anymore, something crossed a line and kept going. Then slowly, carefully, our friendship changed. Fewer calls, shorter messages, long stretches explained by work, travel, life, reasonable things, adult things. I accepted all of it because trust does not collapse in one dramatic moment. Most of the time it fades quietly while you are still defending it. I sat there and understood finally what I had actually been grieving all those years. Not distance, replacement. The scheduling rotation I had identified the day before now had a different shape in my mind. I had talked openly about my supervisory schedule because I trusted her. I had described my routines the way women describe their lives to people they love. She had simply remembered. I had handed her the blueprint and called it friendship. I put the phone down on the table. I did not cry. Every tear I had for Renata Speaks I had already cried years earlier, when the calls got shorter, and the friendship stopped reaching toward me the way it used to. I had mourned that relationship long before I understood why it disappeared. I was done mourning it now. I reached across the table for my other phone. The personal one. The one Tyrus had no visibility into. I opened the browser. I typed 2 words, Atlanta attorney. I did not call ahead. I drove to my mother's house on a Tuesday morning and walked through her front door and sat down at her kitchen table the way I had not sat down since I was 17 years old. Like the world had done something to me that I did not yet have the right words for. And the only place that made sense was that chair, in that kitchen, with that woman moving quietly somewhere behind me. Claudette Mobley does not panic. She never has. She took one look at me sitting at her table, and she did not ask a single question. She turned to the stove, put the coffee on, pulled 2 cups from the cabinet, and sat down across from me like she had been expecting this visit for longer than I had. She waited, I told her. Not everything at once. I am not sure I could have survived everything at once. The anniversary. The lobby. Lorraine's confused laugh. The gift bag on my lap. The elevator opening. The collar. The kiss that belonged to a man who had never once looked over his shoulder because he had never once had a reason to. And Renata. Claudette sat through all of it without moving. No sharp intake of breath, no hand over her mouth. She listened the way a woman listens, when she is not surprised by the information, but is measuring the weight of what it has done to the person delivering it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "How long have you known?" I said, 5 days. She nodded slowly, set her cup down, folded her hands on the table and looked at me with the steadiness that had anchored me my entire life. She said, "And what do you need from me?" I had rehearsed other versions of this conversation on the drive over, versions where I cried, versions where she held me. What came out instead was the one thing I had been turning over since I sat in that parked car with shaking hands. I asked about the investment documents, the original capital she had put into the Atlanta branch when Tyrus was first structuring it, the money her family had contributed before a single floor of that building was operational. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not surprise, recognition. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood up without a word and walked to the back of the house. I sat at that table and listened to her moving through the back room. A drawer, a closet, silence, then her footsteps returning. She came back with a folder and set it on the table in front of me. I opened it. Everything was there. The original investment agreement, dated, signed by both parties, every dollar documented in clear language. The equity terms laid out by an attorney Claudette had hired herself, because she had never in her life trusted a handshake when her money was on the table. 30 years. That folder had been sitting in the back room of this house for 30 years. Tyrus had built a company on a foundation he did not fully own, and he had spent 3 decades believing my mother's contribution was a family gesture too informal to matter in a courtroom. He was wrong. Claudette walked me to my car. At the door, she took my face in both hands, the way she had when I was small and the world had been too large, and she said, "You were never just his wife, you were always an owner. Act like it." I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat. I already had an attorney's name. Tomorrow morning, I was making the call. Vaughn Ellison's office was on the 14th floor of a Midtown Atlanta building that said nothing flashy about itself. That was the first thing I noticed. No oversized signage, no reception theater. Just clean lines and quiet confidence. The kind of space that belongs to someone who does not need to announce what they are capable of. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with Claudette's folder on my lap. He came out himself. No assistant ahead of him, no formality. He shook my hand, looked at me directly and said, "Come on back." I told him everything. The lobby, the kiss, the 30 years. Renata, her name, her relocation, the scheduling rotation I had only just understood, the family investment, my supervisory role at the Atlanta branch going back decades, the operational decisions, the directives, the meetings I had run while Tyrus held the title. Vaughn did not interrupt once. When I finished, he opened his notepad and asked me one question. He said, "Did you ever sign anything reducing your interest in that company?" I said, "No." He wrote that down. Then he's asked me to describe every operational decision I had made for the Atlanta branch, every meeting I ran, every directive I issued, every time something moved because I said it should. I started talking. I did not stop for 11 minutes. When I finished, he looked at his notes and then back at me. He said, "There are 3 fronts here. The first is the equity claim. Your mother's investment documents establish a formal financial interest in the Atlanta branch. 30 years passing does not erase signed agreements. The second is marital contribution. You worked in that company. Your labor contributed to its growth during the marriage. Under Georgia law, that enhanced value matters in equitable distribution. The third is marital waste. If marital or company funds were used to support the affair, that becomes financially relevant in court." I was still processing the third front when he continued. He said, "There's another issue too. If assets were transferred to Renata Speaks using marital or improperly diverted company funds, we can pursue recovery through fraudulent transfer and unjust enrichment claims, especially if those funds helped purchase property or sustain a lifestyle tied directly to the relationship. I sat with that quietly, not because I needed revenge against Renata, because for the first time since the lobby, somebody was describing the situation exactly as it was. Instead of as something emotional, I was expected to survive politely. I said, "How long will this take?" He said, "Long enough to do it correctly." There was no comfort in the way he said it. It was not meant to comfort. It was a man telling me the truth about what proper litigation actually requires and trusting me to hear it without needing false reassurance. I respected that more than I could say. He explained the reality carefully after that. Discovery, financial tracing, suppoinces, depositions, resistance from Tyrus's attorneys, the possibility of settlement talks before trial. He did not promise me a dramatic courtroom victory because serious attorneys do not talk that way. What he promised was documentation, paper trails, pressure, facts. I picked up Claudette's folder. I thanked him. He walked me to the door and said his team would be in touch by the end of the week. In the elevator going down, I caught my reflection in the steel doors. I looked at the woman looking back at me. Same face, same eyes, but something behind them had reorganized. I had walked into that building carrying a wound and a folder. I was walking out with structure, with strategy, with legal language attached to things I had only been feeling emotionally 3 days earlier. Renata had spent years believing proximity to Tyrus protected her from consequences. Maybe for a long time it had, but protection and permanence are not the same thing. In the lobby downstairs, I pulled out my phone and typed, "Dinner tonight? I'll cook." Tyrus replied in under a minute, "Absolutely. Can't wait." I put my phone away. Neither of us was lying exactly. We were simply operating from completely different information. Vaughn's first instruction was simple. Go to the office. Do exactly what you always do. Do not change a single thing. So I did. I returned to the Atlanta branch that week on my regular rotation. Same days, same times, same entrance, same badge tap, same nod to whoever was at the front desk, nothing different on the surface. Everything different underneath. I moved through that building, and I paid attention in a way I never had before, not to what was wrong, to what was mine. The procurement approvals that waited on my sign-off. The operational shifts that did not get communicated to staff until I had reviewed them. The vendor relationships I had built and maintained for years, while Tyrus held the title and took the calls. That building had my fingerprints on every wall. I had simply never thought to document them. I started pulling copies, email correspondence, records, directives I had issued going back years. Everything I had legitimate access to as part of my supervisory role. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise a question from anyone watching. Just a woman doing what she had always done, except now she was keeping a copy. Vaughn's team moved on the access records simultaneously. A subpoena for the building's badge log. Every date, every timestamp, every entry tied to my name across 30 years of supervisory visits. I did not need to be told that log was going to be long. I had been in that building more consistently than some people who drew a salary from it. The forensic accountant came on that same week. Her job was the valuation, establishing what the Atlanta branch was worth when Claudette's family invested and what it was worth today. The difference between those two numbers was the marital contribution argument made visible in dollars. She also began mapping the company's account transactions from the outside in, not looking for anything specific yet. Building the financial architecture first so she could identify later what did not belong. The outflows, the transfers, the line items that had no legitimate business origin. She needed to understand the whole picture before she could name what was missing from it. I kept those two tracks separate. My document work, her financial work, parallel. No connecting line drawn yet. Tyrus came home for dinner every evening that week. Normal, easy, completely unbothered. On Thursday, he mentioned the Atlanta branch had a strong quarter. Said it with the quiet pride of a man who believed he had built something. I said, "That's good to hear." I meant every word of it differently than he heard it. What I understood that week, what settled into place with a coldness that almost felt like clarity, was why I had never seen the financial drain. Tyrus controlled the business accounts. I managed the household finances. That division had always seemed practical, efficient, the natural structure of two people running a life together. It was also the structure that kept two separate worlds from ever appearing on the same bank statement. Whether he designed it that way or simply allowed it, The result was the same. I had been kept on the outside of the numbers by an arrangement I had never once questioned. I questioned it now. Friday afternoon, I drove home from the branch and sat in my car in the driveway for a moment before going inside. For the first time since the lobby, I felt something that was not grief and not anger. It was focus, clean and cold and entirely mine. My phone rang. Vaughn, he said, we need to talk about Wendell Pruitt. My team has been reviewing the access records, and his name shows up in a pattern worth understanding. I think he knows something we don't have yet. Can you reach him? I had seen Wendell Pruitt in that building for years. We were never close, professional courtesies, nothing deeper. But I had not forgotten his face outside that entrance. The weight he was carrying that had nothing to do with the end of a workday. I recognized it because I had spent the better part of 2 weeks learning to carry my own version of it. I reached out through a mutual contact, kept it simple, casual lunch. Nothing attached to the company. Nothing that could be traced back to either of us professionally. He agreed without asking too many questions. That told me something. We met at a small restaurant in East Atlanta, quiet corner, nobody from Midtown. He was already seated when I arrived, and he had the look of a man who had been rehearsing what he was and was not going to say. I did not give him a script to push against. I told him what I already knew. The lobby, the kiss, Renata's visits on the days I was never scheduled, Claudette's investment documents, the attorney I had retained, the case being built quietly in a Midtown office while Tyrus ran meetings and came home for dinner. I laid it out without dramatics, and then I stopped talking. Wendell looked down at the table. The silence stretched long enough that I did not rush it. Then he said, I didn't understand what I was looking at for a long time. My department isn't accounting. I don't approve executive spending. But operations sees patterns whether they're supposed to or not. Same travel vendors, same rushed reimbursement requests, same conference expenses attached to trips that didn't fully line up operationally. He rubbed his thumb once against the side of his water glass before continuing. I told myself it probably had an explanation. Then, after a while, I stopped believing that. But by then, enough years had passed that saying something felt dangerous. That sounded real to me. More real than a dramatic confession would have. He opened his phone. What he showed me was not some secret accounting archive. It was smaller than that. Fragments. Expense screenshots he had saved over the years because certain patterns kept bothering him enough that he could not fully ignore them. Hotel reimbursements tied to conference dates that never matched internal schedules cleanly. Corporate dinners without corresponding client records. Repeated vendor escalations involving transfers operations kept being asked to process quickly without explanation. And one recurring payment reference. Same timing. Same amount range. Cycling regularly through channels that did not make operational sense. Not enough by itself to prove everything. Enough to make a forensic accountant start asking the right questions. I looked down at those records and understood something. The forensic accountant had already started circling from the outside. This was not occasional spending. This was maintenance. A parallel life, sustained carefully enough to avoid attention, but not carefully enough to disappear completely once someone started connecting timelines. Tyrus had built systems for a living. Apparently, he had built one around the affair too. I said, "You're saying something now." Wendell let out a quiet breath through his nose. Then yeah, I am. He transferred the files to me before we left the table. Copies of the screenshots, notes, dates, enough for Vaughn's team to subpoena the rest properly if they chose to pursue it. He did not make a speech about doing the right thing. He did not ask what I planned to do with the information. He simply handed it over and looked at me with the expression of a man who had spent years trying not to look too directly at something he suspected was wrong. I drove back across Atlanta with those documents on the passenger seat. I was not angry. Anger would have been too loud and too small for what I was actually feeling. What I felt was clarity, the kind that arrives piece by piece until suddenly there are enough pieces on the table that pretending not to see the picture becomes impossible. I called Vaughn from the car. I said, "I have records that explain where your forensic accountant needs to look." A pause. Then, "How solid?" I looked over at the phone sitting beside me. I said, "Solid enough to matter." He was quiet for half a second. Then, "Come in first thing tomorrow." Vaughn spread Wendell's documents across the conference table and did not speak for 3 minutes. He did not need to. The forensic accountant was already working, pulling the records into sequence, categorizing dates, matching reimbursements against conference schedules, tracing payment paths one transfer at a time. I watched her move through those pages with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent years learning how financial concealment behaves when people think nobody is paying attention closely enough. The recurring transfer pattern was the first thing she isolated, not because it proved everything by itself, because it connected too many unrelated things too neatly. She enlarged one section on her screen and walked us through it carefully. Company-controlled accounts, repeated outgoing transfers, timing that matched certain travel periods, then property records connected to a house registered in Renata Speaks's name. The house had not been purchased outright through one dramatic payment. It was slower than that. A series of financial movements over years, transfers, reimbursements, executive discretionary expenses routed through accounts, Tyrus approved personally, small enough individually to avoid triggering internal review thresholds, spread across conference budgets, travel allocations, and vendor reimbursements that operations processed routinely because executive expenses were not audited the same way ordinary departmental spending was. Consistent enough collectively to create a pattern once somebody finally mapped the whole thing. The forensic accountant laid it out plainly. Dates, transfer amounts, deed records, account timing. Not emotion, documentation. This was not a theory anymore. It was a financial trail running from accounts connected to the Atlanta branch. My mother's family helped fund into property tied to the woman sleeping with my husband. Vaughn let the silence sit for a moment before speaking. Then he explained what it meant. Every documented dollar potentially strengthened the marital waste argument, company and marital resources used outside the marriage over an extended period of time. And if the court accepted the tracing analysis, Vaughn's team could pursue recovery claims tied to the portion of the property funded through those transfers. Not because Renata had committed some dramatic crime, because Georgia courts take fraudulent diversion of marital assets seriously when the paper trail is strong enough. He explained it carefully. Real attorneys always do. There were no guarantees. Tyrus's legal team would challenge the tracing. They would argue business purpose. They would question assumptions. They would say the expenditures fell within executive discretion and had legitimate operational explanations. They would try to settle before discovery widened further. But Vaughn believed the structure of the case was becoming difficult to explain away cleanly. Then he said, "We are approaching filing readiness." I sat quietly for a moment. Then I said, "Give me one more week." He looked at me, did not argue, wrote something in his notepad. Then 1 week, I left his office and drove to the Atlanta branch. I badged in. I walked through every floor. Operations, conference rooms I had spent years running meetings inside. Hallways where employees moved on directives carrying my name long before anyone outside that building understood how much authority I actually held there. I touched nothing. I just looked. I needed to see it one more time as mine before attorneys, filings, and courts turned everything into language. Then I left. That evening I was home when my phone rang. Tyrus had called earlier from the office. Something in his voice had been slightly different, not accusatory, not suspicious exactly, just unsettled. Like a man reaching for something familiar and finding it shifted half an inch from where he left it. He asked if I had spoken to anyone lately about the company. I said, "Just the usual people." He said, "Right." I asked if everything was okay. He said, "Of course." What I did not know then, what I would piece together later, was that he called Renata after we hung up, not with details, just instinct, that something at home felt different, that I had gone quiet in a way he could not read. Renata had always understood silence well. My phone rang again. The name on the screen was Renata Speaks. I looked at it through 2 full rings. The woman who had built comfort around my absence for years. The woman connected now to a house partly financed through the bones of my marriage. The woman who still believed she was calling a friend. She was calling to take the temperature, I answered. Her voice came through warm and easy, like no time had passed at all. "Shantira, hey girl, I know it's been a while." I was standing in my kitchen. I kept my voice exactly level. "Renata, hey, it has been a while." She laughed. The one I had trusted for 12 years moved straight into catching up. How was I doing? The house. Had I been for traveling? She mentioned Atlanta the way someone mentions the weather. Casually. Like it was simply where she happened to live and had no other meaning attached to it. I matched her warmth note for note. I asked about her neighborhood. I laughed when she said something light about Atlanta traffic. I volunteered small, easy details about my life. A dinner we had hosted. A project around the house. The comfortable rhythms of a woman settled in her marriage with nothing pressing on her mind. I gave her exactly what she came for. She asked about Tyrus the way you ask about someone's husband when you have no particular reason to ask. Offhand. Slipped into the conversation between one topic and the next. How's Tyrus doing? Still's running the world over there? I smiled. She could not see it, but it was there. He's wonderful. Busy as always. We actually just celebrated our anniversary. 30 years, a pause, brief. The kind that lasts less than 2 seconds but has weight in it if you know how to listen for weight. Then, that's beautiful, Shantira. I said, it really is. We talked for 20 minutes. She was good. I will give her that. She kept the temperature of the call consistent, warm, unhurried, genuinely interested in the surface of my life. She did not overreach. She did not ask anything she should not ask. She was doing exactly what she had always done, using conversation as surveillance and making it feel like love. When we hung up, the call ended warmly. No awkwardness, no loose threads. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet around me. I stood there and I let the silence settle. Renata had called to find out if I knew. She had listened for alarm in my voice, for careful phrasing, for the specific flatness that comes into a woman's tone when she is holding something back. She had heard none of it. She was going to hang up the phone and tell Tyrus that everything was fine, that I sounded like myself, that whatever he had sensed was probably nothing. She should have been more unsettled by how fine I sounded. A woman who knows nothing can sound like many things. She does not sound like that. I did not feel triumphant standing in that kitchen. What I felt was quieter and more private than that. I had carried 30 years of friendship in my voice for 20 minutes. Every warm laugh, every easy answer. I had held all of it steady without a single crack. That had cost something, not my resolve, that was untouched, but something. I gave myself the length of that quiet to feel the cost of it. Then I picked up my phone. I opened Vaughn's name. I typed one word, file. I set the phone face down on the counter and went to bed. Vaughn Ellison filed on a Thursday morning. By noon, the paperwork was moving through Fulton County Superior Court. All of it simultaneously. The equity claim, the marital contribution claim, the marital waste documentation, and the fraudulent transfer and unjust enrichment actions tied to Renata Speaks. Multiple filings. One morning, Vaughn had been precise about the timing. Speed was part of the architecture. File before any asset movement could be triggered. File before either of them realized what was coming. I was at home when it happened. I was not watching the clock. I was in my kitchen making tea, measuring leaves, waiting for water, doing the ordinary things that ordinary Thursday mornings require. When my phone buzzed on the counter, I picked it up, read Vaughn's confirmation text once, set the phone face down, and finished making my tea. Across Midtown Atlanta, a process server walked into the Atlanta branch that same afternoon. He did not approach the front desk directly. He asked Lorraine to let the CEO know someone was waiting in the lobby with a delivery requiring his signature. Tyrus came down. The server met him at the elevator bank and placed the envelope directly in his hand. I was not there. I did not need to be. But I have thought about that moment enough to see it clearly. The way Tyrus would have looked at the returned address. The way his hand would have stilled on the envelope before his face settled into whatever expression he decided to wear in a lobby where people could see him. He read it alone in his office with the door closed. He called his attorney from that same office. I learned later what his attorney said first. Not, what does she want? Not, we can handle this. The first thing his attorney said was, how much does she know? Tyrus said, everything. His attorney went quiet. That silence told Tyrus something he had not fully understood until that moment. That this was not a negotiation opening. That there was no version of this where he controlled the information anymore. For 30 years, he had decided what I knew, what I saw, what I was allowed to understand about my own life. That ended Thursday afternoon in a Fulton County filing room, while I was standing in my kitchen drinking tea. He came home that evening. The envelope was in his briefcase. He did not bring it out. We sat across from each other at dinner. He talked less than usual. I did not fill the space. At one point, he looked at me. Not the comfortable glance of a man looking at his wife across a familiar table, but something slower and more searching. He was looking for something in my face. A crack, a tell, some evidence of what I knew and when I had known it, and how much of the life we had built together I was prepared to dismantle. I gave him nothing. The silence between us that evening was different from every silence before it. Not uncomfortable exactly, something more precise than that. He could feel the difference. I could see that he could feel it. I did not acknowledge it. I passed him the bread and asked if he wanted more water. He said no thank you. Dinner ended. He cleared his plate. He went upstairs without speaking. I sat at the table alone. Same chair, same kitchen, same house I had lived in for 30 years. Everything around me identical to what it had always been. I was not. He called the morning after dinner. I was already at Vaughn's office when my phone lit up with his name. I watched it ring and let it go to voicemail. I did not listen to the message until that evening. Controlled, measured, the voice of a man who had decided that calm was his best strategy. He wanted to come home so we could talk. He said he just needed me to hear him out. I did not call back. He called again that evening. This time I answered. He said, Shantira, I just want to explain. I said Vaughn Ellison is handling my communications regarding the filing. You should call your attorney. A pause. Then he said my name. Just my name. The way a man says it when he has run out of the right words and is hoping the sound of it does something. I said, Good night, Tyrus. I hung up. 2 days later, he came to the house. I heard his key in the lock, and I was already in the hallway when the door opened. He stepped inside and looked at me and started talking. I let him go for 30 seconds, enough to confirm he had nothing I had not already accounted for. And then I said, You should call your attorney. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway in the quiet of that house, and I did not move for a long moment. Not from grief, not from doubt. I had made every decision that mattered. There was nothing left to be uncertain about. The stillness was not emptiness. It was the specific peace of a woman who had finished becoming who she needed to be. Claudette called that afternoon. She asked, How are you doing? I said, Steady. She said, Good, stay that way. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The rest of that week moved with a quiet that had a different quality to it. Renata Speaks stopped coming to the Atlanta branch. The black SUV that had occupied that parking lot 4 days a week for years simply was not there anymore. Lorraine noticed. She mentioned it to a colleague in passing. The kind of observation that means nothing to the person hearing it and everything to the person it concerns. The absence announced itself the same way the presence always had. Loudly, to anyone paying attention, Wendell Pruitt put in his notice the same week. No announcement. No explanation offered to anyone who asked. He cleaned out his desk on a Thursday afternoon and left the building the same way he had entered it every day for years, quietly, without performance. He had already given the case everything it needed from him. There was nothing left in that building worth protecting by staying. I heard about both on the same day. That evening, Vaughn called. He said, Attorneys reached out. They want to talk settlement. I told them we would consider it. I need you to come in tomorrow, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. I said, All right. I went to bed that night with Claudette's words sitting in my chest, like something solid, steady. The next morning, I drove to Vaughn's office. I knew what they were going to offer. I did not yet know the exact shape of it, the number, the structure, what they thought would be enough to make me sign and disappear quietly. But I already knew what I was going to do with it. Lorraine Vickers arrived at Vaughn's office in a pressed blazer carrying a water bottle, looking like a woman who had done nothing wrong and was only now beginning to understand the weight of everything she had accidentally witnessed. Shantira was not there. She did not need to be. Vaughn began the deposition the way he did everything, methodically, without pressure. He explained to Lorraine that she was simply being asked to describe what she had observed. Nothing more. She nodded and straightened in her chair and told him she would answer whatever he needed. He walked her back to the anniversary. She remembered it clearly. A woman had come in with a gift bag, well-dressed, composed. No appointment. She said she was the CEO's wife and asked to go up. Lorraine had laughed. She said it again now, with the same mild discomfort she had worn that afternoon. She had not meant anything by it. It had just come out, because she thought she knew the CEO's wife. Vaughn asked her to describe the woman she believed was the CEO's wife. Lorraine said, she came in regularly, had for years. Black SUV, always parked in the same spot. Staff knew her. She moved you through the executive side like she was comfortable there. I couldn't give you an exact count, but she came a lot. Often enough that nobody questioned it anymore. Vaughn asked whether Lorraine knew Shantira Kingston before that day. Lorraine nodded immediately. Of course, Mrs. Kingston supervised operations, but she usually came through the upstairs operations entrance when she was on site. Most of my interaction was with executive visitors and front lobby traffic. I knew who she was. I wasn't expecting that situation. Vaughn made a note. Then he asked what happened after the woman with the gift bag sat down to wait. Lorraine described the lobby, the elevator opening. Two people coming out together. She did not editorialize. She simply described what she had seen the way a woman describes something she watched, without knowing she was watching anything important. Vaughn asked whether the woman with the gift bag reacted. Lorraine said, "No, she just sat there. She didn't move, didn't say anything." I remember thinking that was strange. Most people would have, I don't know, done something. Vaughn asked about Shantira specifically, whether she had a visible role inside the company. Lorraine said, absolutely. When Mrs. Kingston was in the building, things moved. Meetings started on time. People answered emails faster. Department heads paid attention. Everybody knew she had authority even if she wasn't there every day. Vaughn asked his final question. He said, in your time at that company, did Mrs. Kingston have a visible operational role? Lorraine did not hesitate. She said, she ran that place as much as anyone, more than some. Vaughn closed his notepad. Tyrus's attorneys had requested the deposition be limited in scope before it began. Vaughn had declined. That answer, delivered without agenda, without coaching, by a woman who had simply shown up and told the truth, was the marital contribution claim spoken aloud by someone with nothing to gain from saying it. That evening, Shantira sat at Claudette's kitchen table with the deposition transcript in front of her. Claudette sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Claudette said, she told the truth. Shantira said, people usually do when they have nothing to protect. She drove home with the transcript on the passenger seat. Vaughn called before she reached the driveway. He said, the settlement offer is ready for your review. I need you to come in tomorrow. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. She said, you already told me that. He said, I know. I'm saying it again. The offer was 12 pages. Vaughn set it on the table in front of me and said, read all of it before we talk. I read every page. It took 11 minutes. When I finished, I set it down and looked at the window for a moment before looking back at him. He walked me through it without editorializing. The cash amount was structured to look significant, the kind of number designed to land with weight, to feel like resolution. But the equity claim was excluded entirely. My supervisory role across 30 years had been reframed in their language as informal involvement, present but not compensable, supportive but not operational. They had taken 30 years of my labor and dressed it in language that made it disappear. The company was off the table. Sign here, take the number, release all claims to the Atlanta branch. Clean break. Quiet exit. The property in Renata's name was not mentioned anywhere in 12 pages. Vaughn finished his walkthrough and folded his hands on the table. Then he told me where things stood with Renata. The criminal conversation filing was active and progressing. She had retained her own attorney. Her exposure was documented and real, not theoretical, not contingent on what happened between Tyrus and me. Whatever Fulton County decided about our marriage, Renata was facing that same court on her own filing. The property she had accepted, partially funded by transfers traced directly from marital assets, was at the center of her case. Nothing Tyrus offered me today touched any of that. I picked up the offer and read it a second time. Then I placed it face down on the table. I asked Vaughn one question. I said, if I sign this, does Renata keep the property? He said, yes. I pushed the offer back across the table. I said, tell them we will see them in Fulton County. Vaughn picked up his pen. He did not smile exactly. But something in his expression shifted. The contained satisfaction of a man who had built a case for precisely this moment and watched his client arrive at it without being led. I gathered my things and stood up. He said, I'll have my team notify their counsel this afternoon. I said, thank you, Vaughn. I took the elevator down and walked out of the building into the Atlanta afternoon. I stopped on the sidewalk outside the entrance. The city moved around me the way it always does. Indifferent, continuous, unbothered by any one person's reckoning. I stood there for a moment, not triumphant. Triumph would have required me to feel like I had taken something. What I felt was simpler and more solid than that. I had stopped negotiating with myself about what I deserved. That negotiation, the quiet internal one that women run for years, deciding what is reasonable to want, what is too much to ask for, what is easier to release, that was finished. My phone rang. Claudette. I answered and she asked, "How did it go?" I said. "We have a court date." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full. A woman absorbing information she had been waiting to receive for longer than I had known I needed to give it to her. Then she said, "Good." Just that one word. And somehow it was everything. Fulton County Superior Court, Atlanta, Georgia. I sat beside Vaughn Ellison in a courtroom that had seen decades of other people's unraveling and did not flinch at one more. I had dressed carefully that morning, not for Tysaris, not for the court, for myself. Because the woman walking into that room had earned the right to look exactly like what she was. The litigation had stretched longer than either side originally expected. Depositions, financial tracing, settlement conferences that went nowhere, motions filed back and forth by attorneys billing by the hour, while both sides measured what they were truly willing to lose publicly. By the time we reached final rulings, the case had already exhausted everyone involved emotionally and financially in ways nobody could fully recover from. The court applied Georgia's equitable distribution standard, fair division based on contributions, conduct, and the documented financial history of the marriage. Vaughn had built the case carefully, and, piece by piece, it held. Claudette's documented equity stake was formally recognized. The Atlanta branch had not been built on Tyrus Kingston's resources alone. The original investment agreement, dated, signed, maintained in a folder in the back room of my mother's house for 30 years, survived every argument his attorneys tried to make around it. The court record reflected that contribution permanently now. My marital contribution was established through access records, email correspondence, operational directives tied to my name across decades, and Lorraine Vickers's deposition testimony describing the role I actually held inside that building. The enhanced value of the Atlanta branch during the marriage reflected labor the court could not reasonably ignore. The marital waste findings shifted distribution further in my favor. Years of documented spending, travel, hotels, transfers, entertainment expenses routed through company accounts, were treated exactly the way Vaughn warned they would be, not criminally, but seriously. The judge did not view the pattern generously. Then came Renata. There was no dramatic courtroom spectacle. Real courtrooms rarely work that way. But Vaughn's team successfully demonstrated that the property held in Renata Speaks's name had been partially funded through transfers, traced directly to marital and company assets controlled by Tyrus. The court imposed a constructive trust over the portion tied to those funds and ordered partial financial recovery back into the marital estate. Partial, not complete. Some transfers could be traced cleanly, others could not. Some records had aged badly over time. Some expenditures sat too close to legitimate executive spending to unwind completely after so many years. Vaughn had prepared me for that. Renata kept a substantial portion of the property after negotiations between counsel narrowed several issues before final judgment. But she did not walk out of Fulton County with the life she thought had been quietly secured for 30 years untouched. The financial recovery against her was real, documented, permanent. So were the legal fees. Tyrus kept his CEO title. That part mattered to him more than almost anything else. But the Atlanta branch itself was restructured through settlement and court order. Claudette's equity formally acknowledged, my contribution share compensated, oversight protections added. Financial reporting tightened in ways that had never existed before this case forced them into existence. When the ruling was read, I did not look at Tyrus. I looked at Vaughn. He gave me one small nod. That was enough. After court, I drove to the Atlanta branch. I did not go inside. I pulled into the parking lot and stopped in the space where the black SUV had sat 4 days a week for years. I cut the engine and looked at the building. I thought about the woman who had walked into that lobby on her anniversary carrying a gift bag, who had sat in that chair and watched her husband kiss another woman without making a sound. I thought about how badly her hands had shaken, 2 blocks away from there afterward. And I thought about what happened the moment she stopped shaking and started paying attention. I built something here. I just did not know what I was really building it for. Now I do. I started the car. Low women take what they're given. I learned the difference between surviving something and surrendering to it. And by the time Fulton County was finished with all of us, so was everybody else. I drove away without looking back.